Hey, my name is Matt Johnson, and we need to talk about one of the prettiest lenses for wedding filmmaking that you are probably not using. This lens is the Sony 135mm f1.8 GM, and you're probably thinking, dang Matt, that's a pretty tight lens. But I would argue that there is something truly magical about this focal length, and it's actually because this lens is so tight that it is so good. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing this Sony 135 from the perspective of a wedding filmmaker and telling you why you need a 135 in your life. And to be clear, this video is not paid or sponsored by Sony. They don't even know that I'm making it. I bought this lens 2 years ago with my own money, and before that, I was using the older A-mount version of this lens that I also bought. Bought a lot of 135s, my goodness. And also, heck, while this is a review of this specific Sony lens, I love the 135mm focal length so much, and I think it's so underappreciated that regardless of which camera system or brand that you use, I'm going to say that you need to at least try a 135. I've used Canon's EF-135 and it's fantastic. I've heard good things about Sigma's 135. My main point is that this review is as much about the 135mm focal length as a whole as it is about this specific Sony lens. All that said, let's talk about why I love the 135mm focal length. In short, it really comes down to three things: the tightness, the aperture, and the size. Starting off with the tightness of the 135, before you use it, you may actually think that 135 is too tight. If the tightest prime lens that you've used up to this point is, say, 85mm, 135 is going to be dramatically tighter, and you may think it's going to be hard to get a good shot with how much closer things are going to look through this lens, but that isn't something that you need to worry about. See, 135mm is a magical point where it's tight, but not too tight. Once you use it, you're going to find that this focal length is almost perfect for head and shoulder shots of people, where if you're standing anywhere from 6 to 10 feet away from someone and you want a very well composed shot of the upper half of their body where you can really fill the frame with them and all the emotion they are experiencing, this focal length is just fantastic. In regards to filming weddings specifically with this lens, this tightness has another benefit, where you are trying to film the couple after the wedding ceremony and you have all of 5 minutes to get some portrait shots of them, and so you're trying to get shots of them together that look good, while the wedding photographer is also simultaneously trying to get shots, and they're constantly getting into your shot and you're constantly getting in their shot, and you're both just jockeying for position, trying to get some usable footage of the couple. This is a big pain, but if you have a 135mm, the odds are that this moment is going to be dramatically simpler for you to film. With the reason being that because your 135 is so much tighter, it is far easier to get these shots of a couple without the photographer stepping into your frame. It's to the point that whenever I film weddings with my wife Rachel, she is typically on a 135 for a significant portion of the day, and she will actually go out of her way to tell the photographer that it's okay if they walk in front of her or block her position when they're photographing the couple, which is usually kind of surprising to the photographer, by the way, but they don't really understand that because her lens is so tight that she only needs a really small window to be able to film. And the odds are that unless the photographer is standing directly in front of her, she's still going to be able to get a good shot over their shoulder. And even if she is blocked, she can just move a foot or two to either side and then be able to get a good shot again. So this tightness of the 135 is really going to help save you if you're trying to film the couple while jockeying for position with the photographer. Next, let's talk about the aperture of the 135mm focal length. This Sony 135 has a maximum aperture of f1.8, which is very wide, especially for such a tight lens, while other 135mm lenses that I've used have come very close and hit f2. I've even heard rumors that Canon's working on a 135 that will hit f1.4, which would be incredible. Typically, with tighter lenses, the widest you can hope to hit is f2.8, which makes this f1.8 on the 135 very special. Going back to talking about how this lens is perfect for head and shoulder portrait shots of people, whenever you combine that tightness with this f1.8 aperture, it's this really magical combination where you get such a shallow depth of field that everything else drops away into creamy bokeh goodness that just looks amazing. Of course, with the Sony version of this lens, because it is the GM version, you get all of the perks that come with Sony's GM lenses, including an adjustable aperture ring on the lens, complete with a clickless aperture switch, which is fantastic for filmmaking. In addition, because this is a prime lens, it is much sharper than a zoom lens, even at f1.8. So you don't have to be afraid of shooting wide open and having a soft image. You can just crank it wide and get this razor sharp in-focus footage that looks ridiculously good. That said though, you better hope that your focus is correct, because at f1.8 you have a very small plane of focus and a lot of bokeh. Like, if you're careful, you may have a person's eyelash in focus but not their eye. It's that precise and shallow of a depth of field. Thankfully, the autofocus of the Sony 135 is spectacular, and this is one of Sony's first lenses that actually included dual autofocus motors to help move the glass back and forth, because whenever you hold this lens, even though it isn't that big, it has a lot of glass inside that it needs to move very quickly to keep things in focus, and these motors do a great job. Speaking of the size of the 135, as I said, it does have some weight to it due to the amount of glass inside. But even then, it is still a relatively compact lens overall, especially whenever you compare it to other telephoto lenses. This leads me into addressing one of the biggest questions that I'm sure you may have, because I definitely had this question before I used a 135, and that question is, why wouldn't you just use a 70 to 200mm lens instead? And this is a great question, especially whenever you consider how versatile the 70 to 200mm focal range is. So why wouldn't you want a more versatile lens than the 135? Well, let me try to answer this as someone that has used a 70 to 200 for a long time, and as someone that still uses two 70 to 200 lenses for wedding ceremonies. When I used a 70 to 200 as a portrait lens to film a couple, I oftentimes found myself using it more at 70mm, because I found that 200mm is really too tight for portraits in most situations. Don't get me wrong, 200 is fantastic for a wedding ceremony where you're not able to get super close to a couple, but if you're trying to film people while you're standing pretty close, 200mm can feel too tight. This led to me oftentimes only using my 70 to 200mm at the 70mm focal length, which is not a very dramatic focal length. Enter the 135mm focal length now. And what's so great about this lens is that you do not have the ability to adjust that focal length, and you're forced to use it at 135. I personally love this limitation, because if you want to zoom in or out with this lens, you have to move your feet, which you should already be doing constantly when filming a wedding so you can get new and exciting angles. But instead of just camping out in one spot, zooming in and out, you're going to be moving around, constantly finding new and exciting angles to film from with this lens. In addition, whenever you compare the size of the 135 to something like the 70 to 200, you can really see how much more compact this lens is. Unlike the 70 to 200, which has a tripod ring that you're supposed to attach your quick release plate to so you don't have as much weight resting on the lens mount of your camera, the 135 is short and lightweight enough that you don't need a lens ring, which can help you film even faster because you don't need to worry about how you're going to mount this lens. Instead, you just put it on your camera like a regular lens and start filming. When you pair these benefits that we've been talking about, like the added sharpness of the 135, being a prime lens, and that f1.8 aperture, you can really start to see why I prefer this lens over the 70 to 200, which will not be as sharp because it's a zoom lens, and it won't be as bokeh-licious either because it only has an f2.8 aperture. So, wrapping up this review then, should you buy a 135mm lens? Yes and no. While I absolutely love this 135mm focal length, and I've made an entire video right now about why I love it so much, if you do not already own a 70 to 200mm lens and you film weddings, I would still recommend purchasing a 70 to 200 first, because that lens is going to be very good and very versatile when it comes to filming wedding ceremonies, which are guaranteed to happen at every wedding that you're going to film. And I really want to make sure that you're getting amazing footage when you're filming them. Once you have that 70 to 200 though, and you're looking to take your portrait shots to the next level, that is whenever I would consider picking up the 135 and falling in love with this lens like I have. With that, thank you so much for watching this review of the Sony 135mm. If you happen to film weddings and use YouTube like me, I would love to help you out even more. So I've created a free guide that gives you some of the biggest and most important tips that took me years to learn as a wedding filmmaker that uses YouTube. This guide is completely free and is going to make a huge difference in the amount of views, likes, and bookings that you get from YouTube, and I would love if you would check it out. You can download the guide for free at the link down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.